Hey there, history enthusiasts. Welcome back to the channel. If you love delving into the hardships and incredible resilience of those who shaped the world as we know it, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories like this one. Now, imagine for a moment that you are one of the early settlers of America, arriving after a long, grueling journey across the Atlantic. The world you are about to enter is unfamiliar, and the promise of a new life is marred by the constant uncertainty of survival. The air is cold, the land harsh, and the very concept of survival itself is in question. The settlers who arrived in the early days of America were not just looking for a new start. They were fighting to simply stay alive in a world that offered no guarantees, no safety nets, and no comfort. The journey to America was already a battle in itself, long, arduous, and filled with countless dangers. But little did they know, the real test was just beginning. The Atlantic voyage was grueling. Crowded into ships like cattle, the passengers were subjected to brutal conditions. The air below deck was thick with the stench of sweat sickness and human misery. Disease spread like wildfire in the cramped quarters, with rats scurrying along the wooden beams, carrying disease wherever they went. Many didn't survive the journey, too weak, too sick, or too exhausted to endure. And when they finally saw the shores of America on the horizon, there was little time to celebrate. The real struggle, the one that would define their futures, awaited them on land. When these brave souls stepped onto the shores of what would become their new home, they found nothing like the promises that had been whispered in letters and maps. The land was unforgiving, wild, untamed, and often hostile. The cold of winter gripped the land early and harshly. Settlers found that the simple comforts of home were a faraway dream. The ground, though, fertile in some places, proved stubborn and difficult to cultivate. What little food they brought with them was either spoiled or quickly devoured, leaving them to rely on the land for sustenance. But the land, too, was harsh and unforgiving. Wild animals roamed freely, and the winter nights were bitterly cold. Even the warmth of a fire was no guarantee of comfort, as firewood was scarce and the cold seemed to seep into every crevice of their meager shelters. Diseases were rampant in these early settlements, with no real medicine to speak of. The settlers had little knowledge of the land's plants and medicines, and what they did know was based on folk remedies that often did more harm than good. A fever could easily turn deadly. A simple injury could result in infection and amputation, and death was always just a breath away. The absence of sanitation compounded the spread of disease, and before long, it felt like a constant battle against invisible enemies, germs, infections, and the relentless cold. But it wasn't just the physical toll that weighed heavily on the settlers. The emotional and psychological strain was profound. The isolation from their homelands, the loneliness of being cut off from everything they knew, began to wear on them. Families broken by grief or sickness struggled to hold on to hope. Some found solace in their faith, while others turned to the land itself, hoping that with each day, the world would become a little more familiar, a little less hostile. But with each passing day, the darkness of winter seemed to hold tighter, and the shadows of doubt and fear grew longer. The settlers, though, did not give in easily. They had come to this land with dreams of a new life, a fresh start, but they quickly learned that survival would be their first and greatest achievement. Each day became an endurance exercise, an ongoing struggle against not only nature's forces, but the very elements that tested their will to survive. As you can imagine, life in early America was far from easy. It was a constant battle against the elements, illness, and fear. But through it all, the settlers endured, driven by an unrelenting hope that someday, against all odds, they would carve out a life in this new, untamed land. If you're enjoying this glimpse into the hardships of early American settlers, don't forget to like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever wondered how people survived such conditions? Make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay connected with us as we explore more untold stories from history. Imagine for a moment the bleakness of your situation. You've spent weeks, maybe months, preparing for a journey you've been told will lead you to a new life, a fresh start in the land across the ocean. The promises of fertile lands, a better future, and a place to call your own have filled your mind with hope. But now, standing on the edge of the ship, watching the shore fade into the distance, you are not so sure. The waves are growing, the storm clouds are thickening, and the horizon seems to stretch on endlessly. You are heading into the unknown, and with each wave that slams against the ship's hull, you realize that this journey will not be as simple as you'd been led to believe. The ship creaks and groans under the force of the wind. Below deck, the air is thick with the smell of sweat salt and something far worse. It's a dark, oppressive space, claustrophobic and packed with bodies. The passengers, crammed together like cattle, are struggling to find a sliver of space to sleep, to rest, to survive. You can hear the coughing and wheezing of those near you, the constant murmur of voices, the rustle of blankets as people try to sleep despite the discomfort. But sleep doesn't come easily. The ship rocks violently, sending waves of nausea crashing over you, the motion of the water never quite settling. There's no escape from the endless motion, no reprieve from the feeling of confinement. You and hundreds of others are stuck in this small, stifling space for what feels like an eternity. The conditions are beyond horrendous. It's not just the space, it's the filth. There are no private quarters, no places to escape from the press of bodies. Every part of the ship smells of human suffering, sweat, illness, and the strong, almost sickly scent of the sea itself. The food is sparse, sometimes stale, sometimes rotten. It's hard to even tell what's on your plate, and it's often worse than what you had back home. But there's no choice but to eat, to fill your stomach just enough to keep the hunger at bay, knowing it will only return in a few short hours. The water you drink is murky, often salted, and it's all you have. It's better than nothing, you tell yourself, but in the back of your mind, you worry. You've heard whispers of disease spreading below deck, of the sick and dying. You try to ignore them, but the unease gnaws at you constantly. And then there are the rats. You can hear them skittering in the dark, their small feet scurrying across the floors, crawling into the corners where the walls meet the floorboards. At first, it's just the occasional squeak, but soon you realize they're everywhere. They slip in and out of the dark, crawling over the crates, the bags of grain, the sleeping bodies. Some passengers scream when they feel one scurrying over their skin in the middle of the night. They're not just a nuisance, they're a threat. The rats carry disease, and you know that every scratch or bite is an invitation to sickness. You try not to think about it, but it's impossible to avoid. As the days pass and the ship continues its relentless journey, you see it the first sign that things are slipping beyond control. Someone has fallen ill, their face pale, their breath shallow. It starts with one person, then another, and soon there are too many to count. The disease spreads quickly, moving from one passenger to the next unchecked by any semblance of medical care. The doctor on board is overwhelmed, as are the few nurses. They do what they can, but resources are limited, and the ship offers little in the way of treatment. You hear whispers that the doctor is just as much a passenger as the rest of you, that the medicines he carries are scarce and old. There's no hope for many of the sick. You can see it in their eyes, the way they grow weaker each day, and it fills you with dread. It's not just the illness that's terrifying, it's the fear that you'll be next. You try to avoid the sick, but it's impossible. The ship's quarters are so cramped that you can't go anywhere without passing someone who is feverish, sweating, coughing violently, their bodies racked with illness. It's hard to keep track of who's healthy and who isn't. You do your best to stay well, but the conditions make it a constant battle. The damp air and the lack of ventilation are suffocating. Even when the deck is open for a brief respite, it offers little comfort. The salt water sprays across the ship, stinging your skin and your eyes. But the air is cleaner up there, if only for a short time. The days blur into one another. Time seems to lose all meaning. The ship is tossed by the storm, the waves growing higher, the wind howling like a beast. You can hear the creaking of the wood, the strain of the ship fighting against the storm. It feels like the ship itself might tear apart at any moment. The sky above is dark, endless, filled with nothing but the promise of more bad weather. It feels like you've been stuck in this purgatory forever each day, an endless cycle of misery, uncertainty, and fear. You long for land, for solid ground beneath your feet, but every day stretches further into the unknown, as if the journey itself will never end. And then the first death occurs. It's quick. A passenger who had been weak for days, their body finally succumbing to the disease that has been spreading. They are hurriedly wrapped in a blanket, their body shrouded and tossed into the sea with little ceremony. You watch as the body disappears into the waves, swallowed up by the cold, dark water. The ship moves on as if nothing has happened, but you feel it in the pit of your stomach. The fear is real now. It's not just something to worry about. It's something that's happening. The days continue to pass, and more follow. One by one, passengers begin to fall ill to weaken. You see the same faces once full of hope, now pale and gaunt, their bodies worn thin from sickness and fatigue. Some die quietly in the night, their last breath taken in the same suffocating air they've lived in for days, while others scream in their delirium, unable to escape the torment of disease. The death toll rises slowly, but surely, and with each passing body, your hope diminishes further. There is no respite. The sea is relentless. The storms continue to batter the ship, and the cold becomes unbearable. The crew members, too, are affected by the sickness, and their fear becomes palpable. It's clear that they, too, are just as helpless in this situation as the passengers. The ship is adrift in more than just the ocean. It's adrift in a nightmare, and no one knows when it will end. By the time the ship finally approaches land, you've lost count of how many have died. The deck is littered with bodies, and the few survivors are gaunt and hollow-eyed, their spirits broken by the endless hardship. When the land finally comes into view, you feel a mixture of emotions: relief, fear, exhaustion. You wonder if the land will be any better, if it will offer the relief you've been desperately waiting for, or if it will only be another challenge to overcome. But even as you approach the shores of the new world, you know that the worst of your journey has been the voyage itself. It was not just the physical strain, the disease, or the storms that nearly tore the ship apart. It was the knowledge that in the middle of the vast ocean, with nothing but the sky and sea surrounding you, there was no escape. You were at the mercy of the elements of fate itself. The journey had already taken so much from you, and the hardest part of all was yet to come. After the long, harrowing voyage across the Atlantic, the first sight of land should have been a moment of relief. But as the settlers disembarked onto the unfamiliar shores of early America, that relief was quickly swallowed by the harsh reality of the land before them. This was not the paradise promised in the pamphlets and letters. They had not arrived to find a fertile Eden ready for the plucking. No, the land before them was wild, unforgiving, and every bit as brutal as the storms they had survived on the open sea. They had barely begun to understand the true scope of their struggle. For you and your fellow settlers, the work began almost immediately, a relentless cycle of labor that would stretch through every waking hour. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, your muscles still sore from the voyage, quickly adapted to the weight of the work. You were not alone in this. Every settler, young and old, took part in the same daily grind. The weather, damp and oppressive, made everything harder. The humidity in the air seemed to cling to your skin, making your clothes heavy and your movements sluggish. Even simple tasks like chopping wood or gathering food felt like monumental efforts under the weight of the unrelenting dampness. The moisture from the air seeped into everything: the walls of your cabin, the blankets that once felt warm, the firewood that seemed to rot before your eyes. Nothing was ever dry. Nothing was ever easy. And then there was the land itself. At first glance, it seemed like it could provide all that was needed. The trees stood tall and proud, their green canopies a hopeful sign that there was life here ready to be harvested. But as you and your fellow settlers soon discovered, the soil was not as fertile as expected. It was stubborn, unyielding, and more often than not, it fought back against your efforts. The first attempt to plow the land for crops was a disaster. The plows dug into the ground, but the soil was tough, rocky, and uneven. It felt as though the earth itself was resisting every effort you made to tame it, to coax it into giving up its bounty. You tried to plant what seeds you had: corn, beans, and squash, but the ground gave little in return. It wasn't just the poor soil that thwarted you, it was the pests. You watched as your crops, once planted with hope, were eaten by insects, rodents, and larger animals that roamed the area. They seemed to be everywhere, gnawing at the roots, burrowing into the soil, stealing whatever you managed to grow. You had learned quickly that every seed planted had to be fiercely guarded, that every crop grown needed to be protected, not just from the elements, but from the land's other inhabitants. The pests didn't care that you were trying to build a life, they were simply looking for food, just as you were. You and your fellow settlers often worked late into the night, trying to scare away the rats or the birds that came to feast on your labor. And then, of course, there were the wild animals, creatures that seemed both majestic and dangerous in equal measure. The forests that surrounded you were full of life, but that life was not always friendly. There were bears, wolves, and other predators lurking in the trees, waiting for an opportunity to strike. You had heard the stories of settlers who had lost their livestock, to predators of families whose homes were raided by wolves seeking shelter or food. Even hunting, which had once seemed like a reliable source of food, became a dangerous endeavor. Wild animals, once thought of as a gift from the land, were now a threat. The fear of encountering a predator while out hunting or gathering was a constant presence in your mind, adding another layer of tension to the already grueling life. As if that weren't enough, the insects became a relentless menace. Mosquitoes, flies, and other pests swarmed the area, their bites leaving you itchy and covered in welts. The damp conditions made the perfect breeding ground for these insects, and there was no escape from them. You found yourself constantly swatting at the air, trying to find a moment of peace without being attacked by swarms. The bugs, like the other dangers of the land, seemed to drain your energy, to wear you down bit by bit. The irritation was more than just physical, it became psychological. It felt like the land was always against you, always presenting a new challenge, a new battle to fight. And all the while, there was the constant struggle to make a home. The shelter you had built, though modest, was supposed to offer some reprieve from the elements, but it didn't. The dampness seeped in the wood, warped, and the constant rain made it nearly impossible to keep everything dry. Even when the fire blazed in the hearth, it often didn't feel like enough to keep the chill at bay. The roof leaked, and no matter how much firewood you chopped, or how many layers you wore, the cold still managed to creep inside. Every day felt like a battle against nature, and more often than not, nature won. The mental toll of this constant struggle was nearly as exhausting as the physical. Each day, you woke up to face the same challenges, the same battles against the land, the weather, and the wildlife. There were moments when you questioned your decision to come here, when the weight of the isolation, the fear of failure, and the pressure to provide felt overwhelming. The promise of a new life had been appealing, but the reality of building that life from scratch was far harsher than anyone had prepared you for. The lack of support was another strain. You had come with a group of settlers, but each of you had your own challenges to face, and there were times when the community felt fragmented. Everyone was struggling in their own way, fighting the land and its many challenges. And it was hard to come together when survival itself seemed like the most pressing concern. Even simple tasks like gathering enough firewood or preparing meals took all of your energy. The emotional toll of constant work, constant worry, and constant danger wore on everyone. There were a few moments of rest, and when they did come, they were brief and fleeting. But amidst all of this hardship, there were small victories, moments when the land gave a little back. You recall the first time you managed to harvest a small crop, something you had grown despite all the odds. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep you going. A reminder that survival was possible, that even in the harshest conditions, there was hope. And as the seasons changed, as the days grew longer, and the weather a little more predictable, you began to see the potential in the land. The soil, though difficult to work, could be tamed with patience and persistence. The animals, though dangerous, provided food if you knew how to hunt and trap. The insects, though, a constant irritation, could be kept at bay with clever solutions. In the end, it was not the land that defeated you. It was your own will, your ability to endure, to adapt, and to survive. The land had tested you, had thrown every challenge it could at you, but it had also shaped you. And though it took everything you had, it ultimately left you stronger. The struggle with the land and the environment was not just about surviving, it was about understanding it, adapting to it, and learning to live with it, even when it seemed impossible. You had learned that survival was never just about strength. It was about resilience, about the ability to face each day, each challenge with the knowledge that somehow you would make it through. As the first snow of winter fell gently on the land, a hush seemed to settle over everything. The once vibrant colors of autumn had faded, and now the world was blanketed in white, a silent, unyielding barrier that seemed to stretch for miles in every direction. The air, once crisp and cool, had turned bitter, its bite sharp and unforgiving. It was the start of a season that would test every part of your being. The cold would not just chill your bones, it would challenge your spirit. The land had gone quiet, and so too had the world you knew. Winter had arrived, and with it came the harshest trial of survival. The first days of winter felt like a slow and steady descent into an endless frozen night. The cold seeped into every crack and crevice, creeping through the walls of the cabin, no matter how much firewood you stacked by the hearth. The wind howled relentlessly, pushing against the fragile shelter you had managed to build. Each night, as the darkness fell early, you would sit by the fire, huddled close, your breath visible in the frigid air, wondering how long the fire would burn, how long you could make the supplies last. You knew that the next few months would be the hardest, a battle not just against the elements, but against the deep, suffocating silence of isolation. The cold had a way of making everything feel smaller, more enclosed. The world outside was vast, but the cabin felt like a tiny island, isolated from everything. And as the days grew shorter, you could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just the cold that was difficult to endure. It was the hunger, the exhaustion, and the loneliness. The world outside had gone to sleep for the winter, and so too had the life that once filled your days with purpose and movement. The animals had retreated into their dens, and even the trees seemed to huddle together against the wind. All that remained was the cold and the constant ticking of time that seemed to drag on endlessly. Food, once plentiful in the warmer months, was now a luxury. The supplies you had carefully stored away were beginning to dwindle, and each meal became more of a struggle. You rationed what little you had, finding ways to stretch even the smallest amount of food to last just a little longer. But even as you ate, there was always the gnawing feeling in your stomach. Hunger was never far behind, a constant reminder that the future was uncertain. Every day was a question of survival. How long would the fire last? How much food did you have left? And if you ran out, what would you do? The harsh winter had a way of turning every little decision into a matter of life and death. In the early days of winter, the isolation wasn't as difficult to bear. You thought of it as time to rest, to reflect, to prepare for the months ahead. But as the days turned into weeks, and then months, the weight of the solitude began to take its toll. The mental strain was the most insidious part of the season. The cold didn't just affect your body, it seeped into your mind, making everything feel heavier. There were days when it felt impossible to get out of bed, when the thought of facing another bitter day felt overwhelming. The silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire, seemed to echo endlessly in your mind. It was a silence that pushed against you, testing your patience, your resolve, and your sanity. You began to notice it in the people around you too. The isolation was not something that anyone could escape. There was a growing irritability that hung in the air like a cloud as everyone struggled to make it through the winter. The cold made everything harder. Chores took longer, energy was always low, and patience wore thin. It wasn't just the work. It was the constant battle to stay positive, to stay strong, when the world outside was so relentlessly harsh. The stress of survival began to show in the way people spoke, in the way their eyes looked. What had once been a tight-knit, friendly community was now beginning to feel the strain of the season. The bonds that had once held everyone together began to fray under the weight of the cold, the hunger, and the constant uncertainty. But the real test came when the isolation turned into fear. Fear that the food wouldn't last. Fear that the winter would never end. You could see it in the way people started to withdraw, becoming quieter, more reserved. It was as if the cold had seeped into their hearts, and no matter how much warmth the fire offered, it couldn't reach the deep places where the fear took root. The world outside may have been silent, but inside, you could hear the whispers of doubt and worry. Could you really survive this? Would the cold ever end? Could you really hold on long enough to see spring? It was during these darkest moments that the true strength of community revealed itself. The bonds that had been formed over the seasons before were put to the test, and it was in these moments that you truly understood their value. The harsh winter didn't just test your endurance, it tested your humanity. The desire to help, to offer comfort, became just as essential as the food you shared or the firewood you chopped. People who had once been strangers now became lifelines. You worked together to ensure that everyone had enough to eat, that the fire kept burning, and that the isolation didn't crush your spirits entirely. But even with all the help, the mental toll of the winter was still immense. The physical work required to simply survive each day, the constant gathering of wood, the careful rationing of food, the endless tending of fires was exhausting. And the hunger. It gnawed at your stomach every day, a constant reminder that there wasn't enough. There were days when you would catch yourself snapping at someone for no reason, when the smallest thing would send you into a quiet rage. You knew it wasn't personal. It was the winter, the strain, the uncertainty. But it didn't make it any easier. And then, as if the cold wasn't enough, there was the mental fatigue, the endless isolation, the loneliness that crept in on the quietest of days when the fire was low and the hours stretched on. It was a feeling you couldn't escape. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was emotional, psychological. The absence of daylight seemed to push you deeper into yourself, and the endless struggle of surviving, of fighting against the elements, became overwhelming. You had to dig deeper, push harder than you ever had before. You had to find a way to keep moving, even when every part of you screamed for rest. The winter was testing you in every way imaginable, forcing you to confront not just your body's limits, but your mind's. It was a battle against yourself as much as it was against the world around you. But despite it all, despite the cold, the hunger, and the endless days of isolation, there was a quiet strength that kept you going. You realized that survival wasn't just about battling the elements. It was about endurance, about holding on to hope when everything seemed hopeless. It was about finding a way to keep moving, keep going, even when the world around you felt like it was falling apart. The winter had tested you in ways you never could have imagined, but it had also shown you the depth of your own resilience, the strength that could rise in the face of the harshest trials. And so, as the days dragged on, and the winter showed no signs of relenting, you held on. You didn't know how much longer the cold would last, but you knew that you could face it because you had faced it before, and you would face it again. The darkness of winter would eventually give way to the light, but until then, you would endure. Because survival wasn't just about making it through the storm, it was about learning to live with it, to adapt, and to find strength in the hardest of seasons. And as the world slowly began to change, as the first signs of spring began to show themselves, you knew that you had survived not just the winter, but yourself. The days after the storm had settled into the bitter cold of winter felt like an eternity. But even as the snow began to pile up and the earth locked itself in ice, a more insidious threat crept in unnoticed. The air, thick and damp, carried more than just the cold, it carried sickness. The settlers, already struggling to endure the frigid winds and limited food, soon found that their fight for survival was no longer only against the elements. It was against something unseen, something that had no mercy disease. You knew the dangers, the smallpox outbreaks, the fevers that ravaged the weak, the infections that spread like wildfire through families. It was only a matter of time before it reached your own community. And yet, despite the years of struggle and hardship, no one had prepared for the extent of it. The medical knowledge of the time was rudimentary at best. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no real understanding of how these diseases spread or how to fight them. What the settlers had were old remedies passed down from the old world potions, poultices, and prayers. But none of it worked. And even if it did, it offered little in the way of real comfort. You could feel the tension rise with each passing day as more and more of your neighbors fell ill. It started slowly, a cough here, a fever there, but it didn't take long for it to spiral out of control. At first, it was the children who were most vulnerable. Their young, frail bodies couldn't handle the diseases that seemed to be everywhere. The same illnesses that once could have been treated with simple care and attention in a larger, more established society now became death sentences in the isolated wilderness. The small cabin that had been a refuge from the cold now felt like a tomb filled with the sounds of coughs, the moans of discomfort, and the shuffle of feet that barely had the strength to walk. You watched it happen. You saw how quickly a mild fever could turn deadly. A simple cut from a piece of wood, a scrape from the rough earth, could fester into a festering wound swollen with infection. You learned to watch for the signs: red streaks under the skin, swelling in the joints, a strange dizziness that signaled a fever that wouldn't break. The old remedies did little to help. Willow bark for pain, vinegar for a wound. But the diseases ran deeper, consuming with every passing hour. People became sicker, faster than anyone could prepare, and what had been a small cough turned into something much worse. There was no help to be found, no one coming to save you. The closest town miles away, and buried in its own struggle, had no doctors to spare, no real supplies to offer. The nearest remedy was often only a few herbs, ones you learned to identify after months of trial and error, but they barely made a dent in what needed curing. The medicine, such as it was, failed to meet the challenge, and so death became a constant presence. The loss of one neighbor felt like it would topple everything, but in a way, it was part of the routine now. The routine of survival in a world where death lingered like a shadow. You could see the way people's faces had begun to change. Tired eyes, worn thin by grief and exhaustion. They no longer wept with the same intensity when someone passed. The first deaths were marked with morning prayers and tears. But after that, there was only the grim reality. The struggle for food warmth, and even the strength to stand, wore down the collective will to grieve. The cold and the sickness never stopped coming. The worst was when the children died. You had never seen grief like it, parents crying out, calling their children's names, but it was all in vain. There was no time to linger. Time was a luxury no one could afford. When death came, it had to be dealt with quickly before the cold and the sickness could claim more. People who had once been healthy, vibrant, full of life, were now fading before your eyes, becoming gaunt, fragile, their faces drawn with pain and fatigue. In the early days, you tried to offer comfort, holding hands, wiping tears, speaking words of reassurance. But soon, even that became a distant memory. The loss was so constant, so raw, that there was no time for anything but the next moment of survival. When a death came, it wasn't the ceremony you might have expected. There was no time for elaborate funerals or memorials. A body was quickly wrapped, often in a blanket or sheet, and carried to the edge of the settlement, where it was buried hastily, as quickly as the work could be done. The soil, frozen solid, made digging a grave nearly impossible, but people made do with what they had, scraping at the earth with crude tools. There was no sense of peace, no time to process the loss. The burial was quick, efficient, and functional. The community could not afford to spend more than the bare minimum time on any death, no matter how tragic. Life, in its simplest form, had to go on. The harshness of the land and the relentlessness of the cold left no room for indulgence in grief. At first, it was jarring, disturbing. You had been raised with the idea that death deserved more respect, more acknowledgement, but here, in this unforgiving environment, there was no space for such niceties. The bodies were buried, and covered, and everyone moved on. There was no time for tears. The next task was always more pressing: gathering firewood, finding food, tending to the sick. If you stopped to feel the weight of the loss, you might not make it through the next day. So instead, you carried on a part of the community's quiet agreement to survive at all costs. Over time, you became hardened too. You saw death not as an isolated event, but as part of the cycle. Each death was a sharp reminder of the fragility of life, but also of the necessity of moving forward. In a way, death became less of a personal tragedy and more of a fact of life. The survivors were the strong, those who could endure the sickness, the cold, the hunger, and continue to work. Those who could not endure were left behind, buried quickly, and with little ceremony, their passing already absorbed into the rhythm of life. It wasn't that you stopped caring. It was that caring in this world was not a luxury. Grief was a weight that had to be borne, but it had to be carried swiftly, without hesitation, or it would drag you down into the cold earth with those who had passed. The emotional toll was immense, but there was no choice. The real test was whether you could endure, whether you could hold on through the endless cycle of death, sickness, and hardship. As the weeks dragged on and the spring began to tease the horizon, the memory of those who had died remained with you. But even as the land thawed and the warmth of new life began to seep in, you knew that the scars of the winter, the deaths, the sickness, the toll it took on your heart would linger forever. The land was harsh, and the struggle for survival was constant. But it was in those moments of quiet grief, those brief, brutal reminders of human fragility, that you truly understood the depth of your own resilience. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that despite the overwhelming weight of death, despite the hardships and the trials, life, however fragile, could still find a way to continue. The bitter cold of winter had long since settled in, and the struggles of surviving in the harsh new world of early America were wearing on the settlers. With each passing day, the challenges seemed to multiply. Food was scarce, shelter was inadequate, and the unrelenting weather made even the simplest of tasks feel monumental. Yet as difficult as the physical hardships were, there was another, perhaps even greater challenge: the presence of the indigenous peoples who had lived on this land long before the settlers arrived. The settlers, freshly arrived and eager to make their mark on the land, found themselves ill-prepared for the complexity of the world they had come to inhabit. They had been told stories of vast forests and fertile soil, of opportunities that awaited them if they could only endure the trials of the journey. But what they had not been told was that they were not the first to lay claim to this land. The indigenous peoples, with their rich cultures, deep knowledge of the land, and survival techniques honed over generations, had long lived in harmony with the environment. They understood the rhythms of nature, the way the land could provide, and how to navigate its dangers. But the settlers, in their desperation and ignorance, misunderstood much of what they encountered. What could have been an opportunity for learning, for partnership, quickly became a series of misunderstandings and often violence. To the settlers, the indigenous people were nothing more than savages, primitive and uncivilized. They did not see the complexity of the indigenous cultures or the depth of their wisdom. Instead, they saw only what they feared or did not understand. When the first encounters happened, they were tentative, cautious. The settlers eager to establish themselves were unsure of how to interact with the indigenous peoples. Many of the settlers had never seen people who lived in such harmony with the land, who seemed to know its secrets better than anyone else. There was curiosity, yes, but also suspicion. The indigenous people, for their part, were equally wary of the settlers. They had seen their land encroached upon, their resources pillaged, and their people displaced by those who came with foreign ways and foreign intentions. They had their own methods of survival, their own ways of life, and they were not quick to trust those who sought to disrupt that. The tension was palpable. As time passed, what had begun as cautious observation quickly turned to conflict. Settlers desperate to survive began to see the indigenous people as obstacles, barriers between them and the land they felt they were entitled to. As crops failed, as food grew scarcer, the settlers' desperation led to violent encounters. These early skirmishes were often sparked by misunderstandings, fueled by fear, ignorance, and the settlers' lack of knowledge of the land. The indigenous peoples, defending their homes, their families, and their resources, fought back often fiercely. The settlers, unfamiliar with the ways of the land, struggled to defend themselves against people who knew it better than they ever could. The violence was not always immediate, nor was it one-sided. There were moments of peace, of negotiation, of attempts at understanding. Occasionally, there would be trade exchanges of goods, tools, food, furs, and knowledge. The settlers would receive food from the indigenous people, or learn new methods of hunting, fishing, and gathering from them. These moments, though, were fleeting, and the tension between the two groups simmered just below the surface. Each encounter, though occasionally peaceful, felt like a prelude to violence, a reminder of how little the settlers truly understood about the people they were attempting to displace. The settlers, with their limited knowledge of the land, were forced to rely on the indigenous peoples for survival in ways they never anticipated. In their struggle to adapt to the new world, they found themselves turning to those they had once considered inferior. And it was in these moments that the settlers began to recognize the depth of indigenous knowledge, how the indigenous people used the land to their advantage, the herbs they used for medicine, the ways they navigated the forests, and the methods they used to hunt. These were things the settlers desperately needed to learn. But the settlers, in their arrogance, could not always see the value in the knowledge being offered. Instead, they saw only difference, something to be feared or fought against. The first alliance between settlers and indigenous people came as a necessity. The settlers were struggling, their crops failing, and their supplies running low. Desperation led them to seek out the local tribes to ask for help, to offer whatever trade they could. Some tribes, understanding the settlers' plight, agreed to share their knowledge to provide food and to teach the settlers how to survive in the wild. The settlers, in turn, offered tools, goods, and their services in return. For a time, there was cooperation, and it seemed that a fragile peace might be possible, but this peace was always fleeting. The settlers, driven by their hunger for more land, could never truly understand the complexities of the land they were claiming, and the indigenous people could never forget the threat that the settlers posed. Tension simmered beneath the surface, and what had begun as cooperation soon turned back into conflict. Each side saw the other as a threat, and it wasn't long before the alliances that had been formed were torn apart by mistrust and violence. What had once been mutual respect turned into territorial battles as both sides fought for control over the land, each believing that their survival depended on it. The settlers, in their ignorance, continued to misunderstand the indigenous way of life. They saw the indigenous people's close connection to the land, their deep spiritual relationship with nature, as something foreign, something that did not align with their own beliefs. The settlers viewed the land as something to be tamed, something to be controlled. The indigenous people, in contrast, saw themselves as part of the land deeply connected to it. This fundamental difference in worldview created an unbridgeable gap, and no matter how many peaceful encounters took place, there was always an underlying tension. It was during these times of tension that the true nature of the settlers' survival strategy became apparent: violence. When negotiations failed, when trade became too difficult, the settlers resorted to force, believing that their survival depended on dominance. And in many cases, the indigenous peoples fought back with all the ferocity they could muster, defending their land, their families, and their way of life. The violence escalated, and the settlers' misunderstandings of the land, its people, and its resources led to irreparable damage on both sides. And yet, amid all the conflict and destruction, there were moments of alliance that stood out like brief flashes of light. There were times when settlers and indigenous peoples found common ground, when mutual survival depended on cooperation. There were moments when both sides, despite their differences, recognized that they shared something important: a desire to live, to thrive, to continue. These moments were fleeting, yes, but they held a truth that would remain long after the dust settled. The settlers had much to learn from the indigenous peoples, but their arrogance, their inability to see beyond their own narrow perspective, led them to squander the opportunity for lasting peace. As the years passed, the stories of these encounters became part of the fabric of early America tales of violence, of alliances, of misunderstandings, and of fleeting moments of peace. The settlers' history, written by those who survived and conquered, often omitted the truth of what had happened, glossing over the pain, the loss, and the destruction. The indigenous people's stories, too, were buried, erased by the settlers who sought to claim the land as their own. Yet despite the years of conflict and loss, the stories of those early encounters remained. The indigenous people's deep knowledge of the land, their survival techniques, and their resilience in the face of violence and displacement became part of the legacy they left behind. And though the settlers misunderstood and mistreated them, the indigenous people's connection to the land endured. The lessons learned from these encounters, both the mistakes and the successes, remained etched in the history of America, a testament to the complexity of survival, the cost of misunderstanding, and the strength of those who fought to remain connected to the land they had always called home. The bitter wind howled across the land, wrapping its icy fingers around the cabin walls. As winter's grip tightened, so too did the grip of authority in the New World. You felt it in the air, thick with tension, a quiet but undeniable presence that weighed heavily on everyone. It wasn't just the cold that made people uneasy. It was the strict rules, the iron hand of power, that had been forged in the fires of the colony's early days. The settlers had not come to a land of freedom and opportunity. They had come to a place where survival depended not just on physical strength, but on obedience. Here in this wilderness, authority was absolute, and the cost of defiance was high. As a new settler, you quickly learned that the rules governing this land were unforgiving. That authority was enforced with a level of severity that left no room for hesitation or leniency. The laws of the land were strict punishments, swift and often harsh, with little room for dissent. The very survival of the community depended on the strict observance of these laws, and there was little patience for those who challenged them. Everything from trade to personal conduct was regulated by an invisible yet unyielding force, an unspoken understanding that to break the law was to risk everything. In the early days, when the settlement was still fragile, people knew that any sign of disorder, any hint of rebellion, could spell the end. Survival was hard enough in the wilderness without the added burden of disunity. The leaders be they chosen by the colony, or thrust into positions of power by circumstance held authority with an iron fist. Their decisions were final, and their commands were obeyed without question. Punishments were severe whipping, public shaming, and sometimes even banishment methods designed not just to punish, but to send a clear message to everyone else. This was a place where order was not just desired, it was essential. The law was the boundary that kept the chaos of the wilderness at bay, and anyone who dared cross it had to be dealt with swiftly or risk destroying the fragile foundation of the colony. You witnessed it firsthand the first time you saw a man publicly punished for theft. The crime was simple. He had stolen food from a neighbor's small stash of dried meat, but the consequences were anything but simple. The entire settlement gathered in the center of town, standing in the cold to watch, as the accused was led to the center, his hands bound. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire in the distance. There was no room for pity, no space for a second chance. The law was clear, and the punishment was swift. The man was whipped hard, brutal strikes that made you wince with each blow. The air around you seemed to freeze, the sharp crack of the lash ringing out, filling the silence with an unmistakable message. There was no tolerance for disobedience. You felt a shiver, not just from the cold, but from the realization that this could happen to anyone. The laws were not negotiable. But it wasn't just criminals who felt the weight of authority. It was everyone. The settlers, newly arrived and struggling to find their place, quickly realized that their social standing was as precarious as their survival. Who you were, where you came from, and who you worshipped mattered far more than any ability to survive in the wilderness. Social status was determined by one thing above all: faith and obedience. If you were seen as devout, as loyal to the colony's religious orders, you were granted a place of respect. If you faltered, if you strayed in your beliefs, even in the smallest way, your standing could vanish. There were no gray areas. Faith was absolute, and your social worth was tied to how well you adhered to the teachings of the colony's religious leaders. It wasn't just the settlers' private faith that was under scrutiny. It was their outward actions, their behavior within the community. If you were seen to question the authority of the religious leaders, if you expressed doubt or spoke against the rules of the colony, you were a target. The social hierarchy was rigid. And those at the bottom, outsiders, those without the proper pedigree, women found themselves subject to constant suspicion, even more so if they were perceived as rebellious or outside the social norms. Women in particular were treated with a kind of suspicion that made you uncomfortable. They were expected to adhere to a strict set of roles, those of wife, mother, caregiver. Any deviation from this was seen as a challenge to the social order itself. You recall the first time you saw a woman punished for speaking out of turn in church. Her offense was small by modern standards. She had whispered something during the service, a quiet comment to the woman beside her. But in the eyes of the religious leaders, it was unforgivable. She was dragged from the pew, humiliated in front of the entire congregation, and given a public punishment, a reminder to everyone of what happened when the social order was disrupted. The shame was more than just physical. It was the social isolation that followed the whispers behind closed doors, the coldness of neighbors who now saw her as a threat to the established norms. You could see it in the way the other women, who had once spoken to her with kindness, now kept their distance. There was no room for doubt, no space for rebellion, even in the smallest of things. The settlers' world was a place where authority had no mercy, where conformity to the religious and social order was not just expected, it was demanded. Those who were seen as outside the boundaries were marginalized, treated with suspicion, and often punished in ways that left scars far deeper than physical wounds. The consequences were not always immediate, but they were long-lasting. Outsiders, those who had come to the colony seeking a new life, but who did not share the same faith or beliefs, quickly learned that they had little place in this world. They were seen as untrustworthy, as dangers to the social order. Even the smallest sign of deviation, speaking differently, dressing differently, or practicing a different faith, was enough to mark them as a threat. The colony's strict religious control meant that there was no room for diversity of thought, no space for any idea that didn't align with the accepted norms. Those who resisted were often pushed to the edges of society, their lives made increasingly difficult. And then there were the women, the silent soldiers of the colony's social order. They were expected to stay within the boundaries defined for them: wife, mother, caregiver, and any attempt to step outside of those roles was viewed as a threat to the very fabric of society. Women had few rights, little power, and even less ability to influence the decisions made by the men in charge. They were often dismissed, ignored, or even punished for attempting to have a voice. When a woman spoke too loudly, when she expressed an opinion that strayed from the colony's religious guidelines, the consequences were swift and severe. Women were expected to maintain silence in the face of authority, to submit without question, or risk being labeled as troublemakers, outcasts, or worse. The strictness of this social order wasn't just limited to the settlers, it extended to every aspect of life. In every community, in every cabin, in every conversation, there was an undercurrent of fear. Fear of breaking the rules, of being caught in a lie, of being seen as less than devout, less than obedient. And so, life became a balancing act. You watched as the seasons passed, how everyone adjusted to the oppressive weight of this social order, how they learned to behave, to speak, to think in ways that would protect them from punishment. You learned, too, that any failure to comply was met with swift retaliation, whether it was public humiliation, physical punishment, or social exclusion. Through all of this, there was one constant that shaped every part of the colony's life authority. It was unyielding, unbending, and unforgiving. The settlers had come to the New World not just to find new land, but to impose a strict system of rules, beliefs, and behaviors. For them, the physical survival of the colony was not enough. They needed order, they needed structure, and they needed everyone to follow the rules without question. It was this need for control, for compliance, that dictated every interaction, every decision, and every action. It shaped the way people lived, the way they related to each other, and the way they survived. You soon realized that in this world, survival wasn't just about food, shelter, or warmth. It was about conforming to a system that valued obedience above all else. The land was harsh, yes, but the social order, the authority that ruled over the settlers, was just as relentless, just as suffocating. And in that world, the price of defiance, whether by an outsider, a woman, or even a child, was one that few could afford to pay. The first light of day would break across the sky like a silent command, and the entire settlement seemed to wake up with it. You could hear the sound of axes chopping through wood, the scrape of shovels digging into frozen earth, and the creaking of homes as they withstood the pressure of the cold. The work was never-ending, relentless, a constant march of necessity. Each day was a struggle against time, a battle for survival that began before the sun rose and lasted well after it had disappeared beneath the horizon. As you looked around, you saw the same faces, the same tired eyes. The men with their strong arms and rough hands handled the most visible tasks: the chopping of wood, the clearing of fields, the building of homes. The women, equally weary, worked in the shadows of the household, managing tasks that no one else could or would do. And the children, though small and often unsure, were quickly pressed into service. This was not a place where idle hands were tolerated. In the harsh new world they had entered, every person, regardless of age or gender, was expected to contribute. The men in their roles had a kind of rugged independence. They were tasked with the outdoor labor, chopping firewood to keep the cold at bay, tilling the stubborn soil to try and grow what little they could, and building structures that were supposed to withstand the elements. It was hard work, and it often seemed like the land fought them every step of the way. The tools were basic axes, shovels, and rough-hewn plows, and those tools often broke under the strain of the task. There were no conveniences to ease the work, no modern machinery or technology to help speed things along. Every swing of the axe, every shovelful of dirt had to be earned with sweat and muscle. The cold made it worse. The men worked long hours, their hands and faces raw from exposure, but there was no choice. The land had to be tamed, the homes had to be built, and the firewood had to be chopped. The winters, in particular, made these tasks all the more critical. The threat of starvation or freezing to death was constant, a reminder that if the men did not work hard enough or fast enough, the consequences would be dire. Every day, they fought against nature, against their own exhaustion, and against the creeping fear that they would not be able to provide enough to see the family through. And yet, while the men bore the visible brunt of the outdoor labor, it was the women who carried the double burden. Inside the house, there was no rest. Women were expected to handle the cooking, the cleaning, the care of children, and the nursing of the sick. They were the heartbeat of the home, keeping the fire burning, and the food cooking, making sure that the house was as warm and safe as possible in the face of the relentless cold outside. But their labor didn't stop there. Every woman was also a nurse, often without any formal training, learning through necessity to treat injuries and illnesses with whatever they could find. If a child fell ill or a man returned from the fields with an injury, it was the women who would tend to them, applying salves, bandages, and whatever medicine could be scavenged. It wasn't just that the women worked indoors. The work was physically demanding, often involving long hours spent on their feet, cooking meals over a fire, scrubbing floors, and preparing food for the entire household. But it was also emotional labor, caring for children, offering comfort, and ensuring that the mental and emotional well-being of the family was tended to as much as the physical. In many ways, the women were the glue that held everything together, managing both the day-to-day survival and the emotional toll of living in such an unforgiving world. In a world where every person was expected to pull their weight, the burden placed on women was staggering. And yet, it was one that they bore without complaint, because there was no choice. They had to. The family depended on them. The community depended on them. And the settlement itself depended on them. There was little room for rest, no time for leisure or self-care. The women were the silent warriors, working from sunup to sundown to keep their families alive. And then there were the children. They were not spared. In the early days of settlement, children were expected to contribute physically in whatever way they could. There were no schools, no classrooms, no teachers. The children didn't have the luxury of formal education. Instead, they learned survival skills, how to tend a fire, how to carry firewood, and how to help with the chores. They learned the way the land worked, how to find food, how to grow it, how to hunt, and how to protect the family from predators. The children worked alongside their parents, contributing in small ways at first. But as they grew older, their work became more substantial. The boys were taught to hunt, to chop wood, and to help with the fields. The girls, although still expected to help with household tasks, were also trained to be caretakers and nurturers, learning how to cook clean and tend to the sick. While the tasks were gendered, the underlying message was clear. No one was exempt from the responsibility of ensuring survival. The children learned from watching their parents, picking up skills as they went along, understanding that their future depended on their ability to contribute. In the evenings, after a long day of hard labor, the family would come together around the fire. It was here, in the warmth of the hearth, that the small moments of connection occurred. It was a fleeting break from the exhaustion of the day, a chance to sit together as a family, to share a meal, and perhaps to talk. But even during these moments, the awareness of what was at stake never truly left. The conversations were often practical. Who would chop wood tomorrow? Who would help with the planting? Who would take care of the animals? The weight of the day's work carried into the night, and sleep was brief, interrupted by the ever-present worries about the coming day. But the work was never-ending. Even when the weather was mild and the days were longer, the labor was ceaseless. Every season demanded different work, and there was no break, no respite. Winter required stocking up on food and firewood. Spring meant planting and preparing for the coming months. Summer was the season for harvest, and fall was for gathering and repairing. Each season came with its own set of challenges, and the family worked through them all, with each member playing their part. The daily labor of the early settlers was grueling, unrelenting, and never-ending. The men working the land and building shelter were often physically exhausted, their bodies aching from the constant labor. The women burdened with the tasks of maintaining the household, caring for children, and nursing the sick bore their own kind of exhaustion, one that was not often seen or acknowledged. And the children, though they were small, were expected to pull their weight learning skills that would serve them for the rest of their lives. Every task, every chore, was a part of the larger struggle to survive in a world that was indifferent to your needs, that didn't care if you were tired, if you were sick, or if you were just a child. In this world, survival meant work. It meant sacrifice. It meant that everyone, no matter their age or gender, had a part to play. Through all of this, there was no time for complaint, no space for weakness. The settlers, both men and women, had come to this land with dreams of a better life. But the reality was far harsher than they had imagined. The land was unforgiving, and the work was constant, but it was the labor, the tireless effort of every member of the community that allowed them to survive. The children grew into capable adults, the men and women learned to work together, and the community became stronger with each passing season. The daily labor, though exhausting, became the heartbeat of the settlement. And through it all, the settlers endured, united by their shared struggle and their shared hope for a better future. The days had grown longer, but the cold had not relented. The bitter chill of winter, which had first crept in with the winds of early December, now seemed to linger endlessly, hanging in the air like an unshakable presence. Each morning, the frost clung to the window panes, coating them in a layer of icy white that blocked out the weak rays of sunlight. Inside the small, meager cabins, the air felt thick, heavy, almost oppressive. It wasn't just the cold that drained you. It was the dampness, the constant wetness that seeped into the walls, into your bones, that made everything harder. The fire in the hearth, though, welcome did little to push back the cold in such an unforgiving place. You had come to the settlement with hope, with the promise of a new life, a fresh start. But now, as the days blurred into each other, that hope felt like a distant memory, a faint whisper drowned by the exhaustion that had settled deep within you. The constant struggle to stay warm, to gather food, to keep the fire burning had worn down your body. The physical labor was relentless, chopping wood, hauling water, tending to the animals, and clearing the land. Each task drained you further, and yet there was no choice but to keep going. You knew that without this work, without this struggle, survival was impossible. But the physical strain wasn't the only toll winter exacted. The isolation, too, began to gnaw at your soul. There were moments when the silence of the land felt suffocating, when the endless expanse of white outside your door seemed to stretch on forever, a reminder that the world was shut off from you, that you were alone in this fight. The harshness of the environment, the cold, the damp, the dark, the quiet began to seep into your mind, making everything feel heavier, darker, It wasn't just about surviving the winter. It was about surviving the weight of your own thoughts. The crushing realization that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you tried, it might never be enough. You could feel it, the creeping sense of cabin fever that settled in as the days grew shorter. There were moments when you'd sit by the fire, the crackle of the logs, the only sound, and the silence around you would press in unbearable. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on you, making the space feel smaller, more suffocating. It wasn't just the physical confinement, the small cabin with its bare wooden walls, its makeshift furnishings. It was the mental confinement, the sense that you were trapped, with no way out, no escape from the struggle, the isolation. You had come here to find a better life, but now it felt like the walls were closing in on you, the weight of survival pressing down on your chest day after day. The others around you, your neighbors, your fellow settlers, weren't immune to it either. The mental toll was not something you could escape, no matter how hard you worked, no matter how many chores you did to keep your hands busy. Everyone in the settlement felt it each in their own way. You saw it in the way the children's laughter had grown quieter, the way they no longer ran about with the same carefree energy. You saw it in the way the women, once vibrant and full of ideas, now looked worn and tired, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The men, too, seemed to have lost something in the fight for survival. Their eyes lacked the same spark they once had. The constant labor, the endless cycle of work, had drained their strength, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. You could see the strain on families. The closeness that had once been a strength now seemed to be a source of tension. The constant togetherness, the constant struggle to survive, was beginning to wear thin. There was no room to breathe. The children, too, felt the strain. The absence of play, the lack of a safe place to explore, left them restless. You could hear it in the squabbles between siblings, the frustration in their voices as they bumped up against each other in the small cabin. It was as if everyone, regardless of age, was feeling the weight of the cold, the isolation, the never-ending grind of survival. As the days grew colder, the sense of isolation deepened. There were no visits to the neighbors, no gatherings, no relief from the quiet. The roads were impassable, covered with snow and ice, and the idea of going out into the cold, harsh wilderness was more terrifying than comforting. Even the children, who had once played in the snow, now stayed close to home, their faces pressed to the windows, watching the world outside, longing for something more. The social isolation had become almost unbearable. The only voices you heard were those within your own family, and even then they felt distant, strained. No one could escape the mental toll of the winter. It wasn't just the physical hardships, it was the emotional weight of being cut off from the rest of the world, of feeling as though you were stuck in this unrelenting struggle with no end in sight. The cold had a way of gnawing at your patience, your temper. You began to notice the little irritations, how the smallest thing could set you off, how the simplest tasks could make you want to scream. The hunger was always there, a dull ache in your stomach, and the cold, it never really left. No matter how many layers you wore, or how close you huddled by the fire. You saw it in the way families began to snap at one another, how patience wore thin, how the stress of survival turned small annoyances into sources of anger. You saw it in the quiet breakdowns, in the moments when someone would simply collapse, exhausted in a heap, unable to go on. It wasn't just the body that was tired. It was the soul, the spirit, the mind. You began to wonder how much longer you could keep going. How much longer can you survive this mental and physical strain? It felt like the world was pressing in, like the weight of the land. The cold and the isolation was too much for anyone to bear. And yet there was no choice but to keep going. The fire had to be kept burning. The food had to be found, and the animals had to be tended to. The struggle was ceaseless, and you knew that you couldn't stop. No one could. But amid all the exhaustion, all the tension, there was still a flicker of something else: resilience. It was in the way the community came together, in the quiet moments when someone would offer help, or when a neighbor would check on you despite the cold. It was in the way people still managed to find small joys: sharing a meal, telling stories, finding brief moments of connection, even in the midst of all the hardship. The cold had a way of isolating you, but it also had a way of bringing people together. You began to realize that despite the mental and physical toll of the environment, you were still here. You had survived each day, even when it felt impossible, and that in itself was a victory. As the days continued to drag on, you couldn't help but feel the weariness deep in your bones. But you also began to understand that this too was part of the struggle. The cold, the isolation, the endless work. They weren't just obstacles. They were shaping you, molding you, and making you stronger. The endurance you had learned to develop both mentally and physically was what kept you going. And when the winter finally came to an end, when the thaw began to break the ice, you realized that the resilience you had built would stay with you forever. The cold, though relentless, had taught you that there was no challenge too great, no struggle too long to overcome. And as the first signs of spring began to appear, you knew that you had endured the hardest months of your life, and that you had emerged stronger for it. The snow was relentless that year, falling in thick sheets that piled up higher and higher against the walls of your cabin. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood, its icy fingers sneaking in under the door, finding any gap they could. Inside, the warmth from the fire seemed to evaporate as soon as it rose into the cold, damp air. The shelter, the small wooden cabin you and your family had worked so hard to build, seemed to groan under the weight of the storm, its walls shuddering with each gust of wind. You had built it with what you could find: wood from the surrounding trees, clay from the riverbank, and whatever else you had been able to salvage. But it was never enough. The materials were poor, the construction rudimentary, and every night, as the cold pressed in from all sides, you were reminded just how fragile the shelter was. In the early days, when you first arrived in the new world, the idea of shelter seemed simple enough. You built something sturdy enough to keep out the rain, a roof over your head, to protect you from the elements. But as the weeks turned into months, and winter set in with an unrelenting force, the reality of what you had built and what you hadn't became painfully clear. The cabin that had once seemed like a fortress against the unknown was now a barely adequate defense against the biting cold. The walls, constructed hastily, and without the proper knowledge were no match for the freezing temperatures that cut through the air like a knife. The roof leaked, the door was warped, and the windows were barely more than holes covered by thin sheets of cloth or animal skins. Each day, you could feel the cold seeping in, more and more creeping through every crack, making the shelter feel less like a home and more like a trap. Firewood, too, was in short supply. You had collected as much as you could in the early days, chopping what wood you could find and storing it carefully for the long winter ahead. But the cold had been harsher than expected. The fire burned through the wood faster than you could chop it, and soon the piles of firewood that had once seemed so abundant were dwindling to nothing. Every day, you would find yourself rationing the flames, stoking the fire as best as you could, knowing that if the wood ran out, the cabin would be unbearable. Even the simplest task gathering wood became a struggle. The cold made your hands stiff and numb. Your muscles ached from the effort, and yet you couldn't afford to stop. If the fire went out, if the shelter grew colder than it already was, survival would become even more difficult. And the hunger. With the cold came the scarcity of food. The land that had seemed so full of promise when you first arrived had quickly shown its harsh side. The soil, difficult to till and filled with rocks, had yielded only a meager harvest, and the animals you had hoped to hunt or trap were scarce. The food you had stocked up on dried meat grains and vegetables was running low. You had hoped that the land would provide, that the hunting and fishing would be enough to sustain you. But now, as winter's grip tightened, you found yourself relying on the same meager supplies day after day. The thought of running out of food was a constant fear, and the hunger that gnawed at your stomach seemed to echo in the cold, silent cabin. You realized quickly that shelter was not just about comfort. It was about survival. Without proper shelter, you were at the mercy of the land, the weather, and your own physical limits. Each night, as you huddled around the fire, shivering, your breath visible in the cold air, you understood the true meaning of that struggle. The warmth from the fire didn't just provide comfort. It was a matter of life and death. If the fire went out, if you couldn't gather enough wood to keep it going, the cold would quickly take over. The layers of clothing, the blankets, the small comforts you tried to gather, they were only temporary solutions to a much larger problem. The shelter itself, the walls you had built, had to withstand the worst the season could throw at you. But it didn't. There were days when the cold seemed to seep into your bones, making everything feel heavier. The thin walls of the cabin provided little insulation against the relentless frost that crept into every corner. The fire, no matter how hard you worked to stoke it, never seemed to provide enough warmth to truly fight back the cold. You could see it in your breath, in the way the frost slowly formed on the walls and on the windows. The cold had taken over, and there was little you could do to fight it. You could layer your clothes, pull your blankets tighter, but the chill in the air would always find its way in. Your family, too, felt the strain of this inadequate shelter. You saw it in their tired eyes, in the way they huddled together for warmth, in the way their spirits seemed to flag with each passing day. The children, once so full of energy, now seemed subdued, their faces pale from the cold, their movements sluggish from hunger and exhaustion. You tried to keep their spirits up, telling them stories of warmer days, of the times when you had hoped for a brighter future in this new land. But it was hard to keep up the pretense when the cold pressed in so relentlessly. There were nights when you would hold your children close, trying to keep them warm as the wind howled outside, and you couldn't help but wonder how long this could last. It wasn't just the children who were affected. The adults, too, began to show the strain. You could feel it in your own body, the fatigue from the constant labor, the exhaustion from the never-ending battle against the cold. You had worked hard to build the cabin to gather supplies to prepare for the winter, but it felt as if all that work had been for nothing. The cabin, despite your best efforts, was inadequate, and the cold seemed to find its way in no matter what you did. There were nights when you lay awake, listening to the wind howl, feeling the cold seep into your very bones, and you wondered if you had made a mistake coming here. Was this land really worth the struggle? Was it worth the constant fight for survival? You learned quickly that survival wasn't just about gathering food, chopping wood, or building shelter. It was about finding ways to stay strong, mentally and physically, when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. The lack of proper shelter, the cold, the hunger, it all combined to create a constant pressure, a weight that bore down on you, on your family, and on your neighbors. Everyone felt it. And though there were moments of warmth, moments when the fire seemed to push back the cold just enough to offer a brief respite, you knew that the true struggle wasn't just against the elements. It was against the constant toll that this way of life took on your mind, your body, and your spirit. In the face of all this, the community began to pull together. Those who had better shelter shared what they could, offering warmth and comfort to those who had little. The collective effort to stay warm to survive became a bond that tied everyone together. Neighbors worked together to gather firewood, to share meals, and to help each other maintain what little shelter they had. And yet, despite these efforts, the reality remained that no one was safe from the harshness of the land. Shelter was everything. Without it, survival was just a matter of luck. The cold never truly left. It would seep into your bones, no matter how much you tried to prepare for it. But in the face of all the hardship, there was something else you had learned, a resilience that grew stronger each day. The cabin, though inadequate, had been built with care. The work had been grueling, but it had been done together. And in that work, in the shared struggle, there was something that the cold couldn't take away. The strength to keep going, to face each new day, was a reminder that survival wasn't just about having the best shelter or the most food. It was about finding a way to endure, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the last leaves of autumn fluttered to the ground and winter took its unrelenting hold, there was something more insidious than the cold creeping in hunger. It wasn't just the long, biting nights or the freezing winds that made survival so grueling. It was the gnawing emptiness in your stomach that reminded you every single day that food was scarce and the battle for sustenance was never ending. You had come to the new world, to this harsh land, believing that it would be a place of opportunity. But now, in the midst of endless cold and isolation, you began to understand that survival was not just about fighting the elements. It was about securing enough food to make it through each day, each week, each month. The early days of the settlement had been full of promise. The soil had seemed fertile, the trees abundant with life and the animals plentiful. But as winter began to tighten its grip, the reality of food scarcity began to set in. What you had planted, what you had harvested in the warmer months, was not nearly enough to last through the harsh months ahead. The storehouses, once brimming with the fruits of your labor, were quickly emptied, and each day you found yourself having to stretch your supplies even further. You and your neighbors had spent weeks preparing for winter, preserving meats, drying vegetables, and storing grains. But nothing had prepared you for the reality of the cold, the pestilence, and the constant battle to keep food from spoiling. The dampness in the air, the freezing and thawing cycles, made even the most carefully stored food rot quicker than you had ever imagined. The salted meats you had packed away in anticipation of winter began to spoil in the humidity of the cabin, the salt unable to preserve them in the damp air. Root vegetables, once thought to be safe in the cool darkness of the cellar, grew soft, wrinkled, and moldy within weeks. You began to understand that nothing, not even the most carefully planned food stores, could withstand the relentless assault of the elements. You remember the first time you truly felt the bite of hunger. It was the middle of winter, when the days were short and the nights seemed endless. The snow had piled high, blocking any hope of gathering fresh supplies, and the last of the bread you had baked was now stale and hard. You had rationed it carefully, cutting each loaf into smaller and smaller pieces. But now, there was nothing left. The firewood was dwindling, and every effort to find more was met with failure. What had once seemed like a promising supply of dry timber was now wet and useless in the cold, damp air. You could barely remember the last time you had a warm meal, the last time you had a full stomach. The days blended and the hunger clawed at you, relentless and unforgiving. Each family faced the same struggle. The women would gather around the hearth, trying to make do with what little they had left. The same meager scraps were cooked into whatever form they could, broths made from boiled bones. Bread, made from the smallest amounts of flour, thin stews that barely satisfied the gnawing hunger. Every meal became a careful calculation. You would sit down with your family, sharing what little you had, trying to make it stretch. There was no room for indulgence, no luxury in the meals. Every bite was a reminder of how precious the food was, how precarious your situation had become. There were nights when you couldn't sleep, when the hunger made it impossible to ignore the emptiness in your stomach. You would lie awake, listening to the wind howl outside, knowing that there was no food left, nothing you could do to change it. The struggle wasn't just about rationing. It was about the constant fear that the food would run out. As the winter dragged on, you knew that the longer the cold lasted, the harder it would be to find food. The animals you had hoped to hunt had either gone into hiding or moved farther into the deep forest, making hunting increasingly difficult. Fishing, too, became impossible when the ice covered the streams and rivers, trapping any fish that might have been caught. The land that had promised such bounty now felt like a barren wasteland, offering nothing but the harsh cold and the empty snow-covered fields. You had no choice but to ration what little you had, and hope that somehow, by sheer luck, you would make it through until spring. But it wasn't just the food itself that was scarce. It was the tools to acquire it. The hunting equipment you had brought was old, worn down from years of use and lack of proper maintenance. You had no traps to catch small game, no proper fishing rods to pull fish from the frozen rivers. The lack of proper tools made every attempt to gather food feel like an insurmountable challenge. Each day, you would venture out into the cold, hoping to find anything that would feed your family. Sometimes, you would return empty-handed, the chill biting at your skin, and the hunger gnawing at your insides. And on those days, you would sit by the fire, trying not to show your frustration, knowing that the next day would bring the same struggle. The stress of food scarcity began to weigh heavily on the settlers. The constant worry, the constant rationing, the fear of running out, it took its toll on everyone. You began to see it in the faces of your neighbors. There were times when people snapped at one another, when tempers flared over the smallest of things. The lack of food, the lack of comfort made every small problem seem larger, more significant. You saw it in the way people's eyes grew darker, in the way they hunched over, tired from the endless battle against hunger. The cold made everything worse, and the emotional toll was just as heavy as the physical. It was on one such day that the first real signs of desperation appeared. A neighbor, someone you had once shared meals with, came to your door with a pale, strained face. He had nothing to offer, no food, no firewood, but he was desperate. His family, he said, had run out of food entirely. They had no more firewood, no way to keep the stove going. The hunger had become unbearable, and he was willing to trade whatever he had left. Some old tools, a few extra blankets, for anything that would help his family survive. You had nothing to offer in return, but you knew what needed to be done. You shared what you had, knowing that you too might face the same desperation in the coming days. That moment marked a shift in your understanding of what it meant to survive. The struggle for food was no longer just an individual battle. It was a collective fight. The settlers were in this together, each one dependent on the other. The hunger, the scarcity, the desperation, it brought people together. Yes, but it also pushed them to the edge. There were days when you saw the stress in the eyes of your neighbors, the fear that the food wouldn't last, the worry that there would be no end to the winter. But there were also moments of generosity, moments when one family would share what little they had with another. You learned that survival, in its truest sense, was not just about rationing food and enduring hunger. It was about sharing what you had, no matter how little, and trusting that the community would do the same. As the winter wore on, the hunger didn't ease, and neither did the struggle. But the lessons learned from those months, the importance of community, the need for patience and endurance, would stay with you. And when the first signs of spring finally appeared, when the snow began to melt, and the ice on the rivers began to break, you knew that the land would once again offer its bounty. But you would never forget the battle you fought, the hunger you endured, and the strength you found not just in yourself, but in the people around you. The land, vast and seemingly full of promise, stretched endlessly before you. It was a land of unbroken forests, rolling hills and rivers that wound through the wilderness like veins through the body of the earth. The beauty of it all, though, had a sharp edge. You had come here with hope, with dreams of building a new life. But as the days stretched on, and you faced the trials of living in this raw, untamed world, you came to realize that the wilderness didn't just offer resources, it offered danger. It was a place where survival was never certain, where every decision, every step could be the difference between life and death. The wildlife insects and unpredictable weather were threats that lurked in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike, making every day a battle. You learned quickly that the animals you had once seen as part of the land's bounty were just as much a threat as they were a resource. The forests, which promised food shelter and companionship, also harbored predators. The first time you encountered one of these threats was a moment that stayed with you, the snap of twigs underfoot, the rustling of leaves in the distance, and then there it was. A bear, massive and imposing, was emerging from the tree line. Its eyes locked with yours, unblinking, calculating. You froze, your heart hammering in your chest. The bear, unaware, or perhaps indifferent to your presence, continued its slow walk, but the moment felt like an eternity. The primal fear you felt was unlike anything you had ever experienced. You were in its territory, and you were not prepared for a confrontation with such a creature. This was no mere nuisance. This was a danger to your life. The bear fortunately didn't approach, but it was a warning. The wildlife here was not to be underestimated. Wolves, foxes, and mountain lions roamed the forests, and though they often kept to themselves, the unpredictability of their behavior was enough to make every trek into the woods a perilous venture. Every step you took through the trees could be the one where you crossed paths with something far more dangerous than you had imagined. Even smaller animals, such as wild boars or rabbits, could pose threats when cornered or when they felt threatened. You had to always be alert, always prepared to react. The land was beautiful, yes, but it was also a place that demanded respect, a place where even the smallest misstep could mean disaster. Hunting, which had once seemed like a straightforward way to gather food, quickly became an ordeal. The animals once thought to be easy prey proved elusive. The larger predators, like the bear and the wolves, were dangerous, but even the smaller ones were a challenge. The forests were dense, the underbrush thick and tangled, making tracking nearly impossible. It often felt like the animals knew the land better than you ever could. Even when you found a fresh trail, you couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching you. Every rustle of the trees could be the approach of something far more dangerous than a simple deer. You learned quickly that in the wilderness, the tables could turn at any moment. But it wasn't just the large predators that you had to worry about. The insects, too, presented a constant and insidious threat. The land, rich in life, seemed to teem with creatures that, though small, were relentless in their assault. The mosquitoes were the first to make their presence known, swarming in clouds during the warmer months. Their bites left you itchy and swollen, but it was the diseases they carried that were the real danger. Malaria, yellow fever, and other illnesses spread quickly with no way to protect yourself, but to cover your skin and hope for the best. You could hear the buzzing around you day and night, the constant maddening hum of the mosquitoes as they sought out any exposed skin. There was no escape from them, not indoors, not at night, not even when you tried to sleep. They were always there, their bites, a constant reminder that nature was both a provider and a predator. But it wasn't just the mosquitoes. Flies, too, were a nuisance, swarming around food, around your face, around the animals you were trying to care for. They carried disease, and there was no way to avoid them. You learned to carry a cloth or a net to shield yourself, but even that wasn't always enough. The flies would settle on anything left exposed, leaving behind larvae in their wake. The smell, The constant buzzing made it feel like the land itself was trying to break you down bit by bit. The insects were a never-ending battle, one that you couldn't win, but you had to fight anyway. It was these constant threats, the wildlife, the insects, that wore you down the most. It wasn't just the physical strain of defending against them. It was the mental toll of knowing they were always there waiting. The constant vigilance needed to avoid the animals and pests made every moment feel like a challenge, and every day was a battle. You began to feel like a stranger in a land that was both your enemy and your provider. The wilderness seemed to shift in unpredictable ways, one moment offering bounty, the next threatening destruction. Survival here wasn't just about fighting against the cold or the hunger. It was about constantly being aware, adapting, bracing yourself for the next danger. Even when you managed to get some food, to gather enough firewood, to find some measure of comfort, you knew it wasn't permanent. The wildlife, the insects, and the land itself would always be there waiting for the next opportunity to take what little you had. There were moments when it felt like the world was closing in around you. The relentless assault of the mosquitoes, the sound of rustling in the trees at night, the constant awareness that you could cross paths with a predator. At any moment, it all added up, wearied your spirit. The threat of the animals was not just physical. It was emotional, psychological. You couldn't relax, couldn't let your guard down, because at any moment, something larger than you might emerge from the forest, or a swarm of insects might descend upon you. You learned quickly that survival in this world required more than just physical strength. It required mental toughness. You had to learn to ignore the fear, to push through the discomfort, and to keep going no matter what. The land would not bend to your will. It would not make it easy for you. The wildlife and the insects were constant reminders that nature was not a benevolent force. It was a powerful one, and it was indifferent to your struggles. Even with all the threats, though there were moments when the wildlife was not just a threat, it was a lifeline. The same wolves that you feared hunting on the outskirts of the settlement also kept the deer population in check, allowing for hunting that could feed your family. The pests, while an annoyance, were also a part of the ecosystem that allowed crops to grow, which kept the balance of the land intact. In some strange way, you had to respect the very forces that made life here so difficult. You had to learn to coexist with them, to find ways to survive, despite the constant presence of danger. But even as you learned to adapt, the wildlife, the insects, and the ever-changing weather continued to make each day a challenge. And with each passing day, you found yourself more attuned to the land, more aware of the risks and rewards it offered. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving the animals or the insects. It was about accepting them as part of the world you had chosen to live in, understanding that survival was never just about conquering the land, but about learning to live with it, to respect it, and to adapt to the dangers it held. As winter's chill settled into the bones of the land, the cold became a constant companion, creeping through the gaps of homes and resting heavy on every thought. Yet, amid the relentless struggles of survival, there was something even more oppressive than the cold, the strict and unyielding religious and social order that governed the lives of every settler. This was not just a place where people fought against the elements for survival. It was a place where belief, conformity, and unquestioning obedience were not only expected, they were demanded. The settlers had come to a new world with a vision of building a life based on their faith and the promise of a fresh start, but that very vision became a system of control. where deviation from the rules could lead to exile, punishment, or worse. You, like all those who had arrived with hope and faith, quickly learned the truth about life in this world. Obedience was paramount. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were laws of life handed down, not just by the governing authorities, but by divine decree. The church held immense power over every aspect of daily life. There was no separation between church and state here. Every decision, every law, every way of life was wrapped tightly in religious doctrine. And the punishment for breaking these laws was swift, harsh, and unforgiving. The first time you truly understood the weight of this system was the day a neighbor, a young woman named Sarah, was publicly reprimanded for speaking out of turn during a church service. She had been raised in a family known for its steadfast faith, but Sarah, unlike her parents, began to question the teachings of the church. Perhaps it was the isolation, the long winters, or simply the weight of living under such strict rules, but Sarah found herself struggling with the authority imposed by the church and the seemingly arbitrary enforcement of its rules. During a sermon, she muttered something under her breath, something about the way the leaders were misinterpreting Scripture, a small expression of doubt. In a community where silence was obedience and questioning was heresy, it was enough to set the entire social order into motion. The preacher, with his sharp eyes and cold authority, called her out before the congregation. The room already heavy with the scent of burning candles, and the oppressive weight of winter became even heavier as Sarah stood before them, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and fear. There was no mercy, no room for understanding. The community watched as she was publicly chastised for her disrespect, her defiance. The preacher's voice rang out his words, sharp and cutting, condemning her as a sinner in front of the very people who had once called her a friend. You could hear the gasp of the crowd, the murmurs of approval from those who believed in the righteousness of punishment. Sarah, trembling, was not only punished with words. Her parents were fined, her family shunned, and she was banished from the fellowship, forced to live in isolation from the community. That moment stayed with you the way the system, the authority of the church, moved so decisively, so ruthlessly. It was a reminder that there was no room for dissent, no room for difference. The church wasn't just a place for worship. It was a structure of control that permeated every part of life. Those who conformed lived in peace, but those who questioned those who stepped out of line would pay a price. The incident with Sarah wasn't an isolated one. As time went on, you saw more examples of individuals being punished for their defiance, for their lack of obedience. The severity of the punishment was always disproportionate to the offense, and the community's willingness to uphold these laws made it clear questioning authority was not just wrong, it was dangerous. You soon came to understand that the system was not just about controlling actions, it was about controlling thought. Religion was everything in this new world, but it was a religion that demanded obedience to the authorities, the preachers, the established order. The settlers, having fled from the old world, now found themselves caught in a new kind of tyranny, one that cloaked itself in the guise of righteousness and divine will. It was a system that had no room for difference, no space for those who questioned, for those who dared to challenge the status quo. The social hierarchy, too, was rigid and unforgiving. There was little room for upward mobility, and the roles were clear from the moment you stepped onto the land. If you were a man, your worth was tied to your ability to work. The land provide for your family and uphold the values of the community. Women, on the other hand, were assigned to the domestic sphere, their value defined by their obedience, their ability to care for the household, and their unwavering faith in the teachings of the church. Their role was to bear children, to care for the sick, to cook, and to tend to the home. There was no room for rebellion, no room for ambition beyond the home. The social system had been constructed in such a way that the roles were fixed, unchangeable, and anyone who stepped outside of these roles was considered a threat to the very fabric of society. Women like Sarah, who tried to speak out or assert themselves in a way that wasn't in line with their prescribed roles, were punished, shunned, ostracized, or sometimes forced into silence. You saw it in the way the women around you behaved, quiet, meek, always careful with their words and actions. To be a woman in this world meant to be constantly aware of your position, to always watch your behavior, to never let your voice rise above what was deemed acceptable. There were whispers among the women, whispers of discontent, of frustration. But there was no room for those thoughts to be shared aloud. Any woman who dared to speak out was seen as a threat to the religious order, to the very foundation of the community. But it wasn't just the women who felt the weight of this strict social order. Outsiders, too, were treated with suspicion and distrust. Anyone who did not conform to the established norms, whether it was in their faith, their way of life, or their background, was viewed with wariness. If you were not one of the established families, if you did not share the same faith, you were looked at as a threat. Outsiders were often forced to live on the fringes of society, excluded from the communal activities, and subjected to harsh judgment by those in positions of power. The idea of community here was not just about living side by side. It was about uniformity. You were not just expected to share the same space. You were expected to share the same beliefs, the same way of life. You saw it in the treatment of newcomers, especially those who came from different lands or who practiced different faiths. They were never fully accepted. Their homes were placed on the outskirts, their goods scrutinized, their very existence seen as a potential disruption to the fragile social order. Even if they contributed to the colony, even if they worked hard and paid their dues, they were never truly part of the community. They were outsiders, and that label was enough to keep them in a position of inferiority, subjected to judgment and suspicion from all sides. And in this world, where the weight of authority and religion shaped every aspect of life, there was no room for doubt. The rules, the beliefs, the social order, everything was rigid, unbending. It was a world where obedience was not just expected, it was enforced. To step outside the boundaries was to risk everything. In a way, it was more than just a matter of survival. It was a matter of preserving the very fabric of society, of keeping everything in place, of ensuring that no one questioned the system. In this new world, faith and obedience were not just the foundation of the community, they were its walls, and anyone who sought to tear them down would be met with swift punishment. You, like everyone else, learned quickly that the price of defiance was high. In this world, survival depended not just on the land or the elements, but on conformity. The settlers had come to this land to escape one system, only to find themselves trapped in another. The rules were clear, the boundaries defined, and the consequences of stepping outside them were severe. In this world, you could survive, yes, but only if you followed the rules, if you conformed to the system that had been put in place. The price of questioning, the price of defiance, was too high to pay. And so, you conformed. You obeyed. You kept your doubts to yourself, and you learned to live within the rigid framework of faith authority and social order. Because in this world, that was the only way to survive. The wind had begun to shift, howling its bitter song through the cracks in your cabin walls. Outside, the land stretched out in endless white, frozen and silent, its vastness both beautiful and terrifying. You stood at the window, staring out at the horizon, your breath fogging up the glass. There was no sign of life beyond the snowdrifts, no animals to hunt, no trees to fell for firewood. The thought that had been gnawing at you for days had finally settled in your gut like a stone. What if you couldn't make it? Surviving here had never been as easy as the stories had promised. The fertile land, the wide open spaces, the fresh start. It all seemed so simple back in the days when you dreamed of this place. But now, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months, the reality was far grimmer. The winters were long and harsh, the land unforgiving, and the resources you had brought with you dwindled more quickly than you could ever have imagined. You had relied on what little knowledge you had of farming, hunting, and survival, but nothing had prepared you for the brutal challenges that came with living in a land this harsh. It wasn't just the weather that threatened your survival. The land, though vast and seemingly abundant, was not as accommodating as it had appeared from afar. You quickly learned that there were no guarantees here, no kindly farmers who could share their crops, no familiar markets where you could purchase what you needed. What you had brought with you, what you had managed to gather before the snow and the ice came, was all you had. And now, every scrap of food, every piece of firewood, every tool you used had to be stretched, reused, and repurposed in ways you never thought you'd need to. It was a matter of survival, of making do with what you had, and finding ways to adapt to the overwhelming challenges this land presented. You quickly realized that resourcefulness wasn't just a helpful skill, it was essential. If you couldn't find a way to make do, to stretch your supplies, to repurpose what you had, you would not survive. You had no choice but to be resourceful, and so every day became a delicate dance of invention. How could you make that last bit of bread stretch to feed your family for one more meal? How could you reuse the scraps of wood from the floorboards to build a shelter? How could you keep your fire burning when the firewood you had was quickly turning to ash? The cabin you called home had once seemed like a sanctuary, a safe place to rest after a hard day's work. But as the harshness of winter began to take its toll, that sanctuary became a reminder of how little you truly had. The walls were thin, the roof leaked, and the space inside felt smaller and smaller as the days wore on. You had no choice but to make do with what you had. You patched up the roof with old blankets and sheets, reused scraps of wood to build a makeshift table, and even repurposed the clothes you no longer wore to make blankets for the bed. Every item in the cabin had to serve multiple purposes. A pot wasn't just a pot. It was a vessel for cooking, a storage container, and sometimes even a heater when you needed to warm the room. There was no room for excess, no luxury of convenience. Everything had to be used, repurposed, and made to last. The first time you had to repurpose a broken tool, you had felt the weight of your situation. The axe, which had once been your most reliable tool for chopping firewood, had broken. The blade had cracked and splintered under the constant use, and for a moment you were left staring at the broken handle, unsure of what to do. But then something shifted inside you. You couldn't afford to be frustrated. You couldn't afford to waste time. You took the broken axe and carefully removed the splintered wood. With what little tools you had left, you began to fashion a new handle from a sturdy branch you had found earlier in the week. It wasn't perfect. It was rough, uneven, but it worked. And that was enough. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. That moment was the turning point. You realized that every day you were going to have to be creative to find ways to make things work, to use what you had in ways that would stretch your resources to their limit. The settlement had no spare parts, no stockpiles of tools. What you had was what you could make yourself, or what you could scrounge from the land. And in a place where survival depended on your ability to adapt, there was no room for hesitation. Every mistake could cost you. Every misstep could bring you closer to the brink of starvation or worse. The need for resourcefulness only grew as winter dragged on. The food supplies that had seemed so abundant at the start of the season had begun to dwindle. The meat you had salted was starting to spoil, the grains were slowly running out, and the last of the potatoes you had stored were beginning to rot. Every meal became a careful calculation, a balancing act of what was left and how long it could stretch. You learned to make stews from whatever scraps you could find, using herbs and roots from the forest to flavor the broths. You hunted when you could, but the animals had grown scarce, their food harder to find in the deep snow. The seasons that were supposed to provide sustenance had turned against you, and each day felt like a race against time. But it wasn't just food that had to be rationed. The firewood you had gathered earlier in the fall was now nearly gone, and the long nights of winter made it feel like the cold was constantly creeping in. The fire was the lifeline of your home, not just for warmth, but for cooking for light. You couldn't afford to let it go out. Every piece of firewood had to be used sparingly, each log a small investment in the warmth and comfort that the cabin could provide. You learned to chop the wood smaller, to make the fire last longer, to use every last scrap of fuel to keep the cold at bay. You even learned how to collect the bark from trees, stripping it down for kindling when the supply of logs ran low. The scarcity of food and firewood wasn't just about practicality, it was about survival. Your mental and physical state depended on your ability to stretch every resource to its limit. The lack of proper tools, the constant cold, the hunger they wore on you, on your family, and on your community. You watched as your neighbors grew thinner, more worn, their faces etched with the same exhaustion and anxiety that you felt each day. But amidst it all, there was something that kept you going, an unspoken agreement to make do, to find a way through. You saw the same resourcefulness in others. A neighbor who had been without food for days showed you how to catch fish through the ice, a technique you had never considered. Others shared their knowledge of edible plants, of ways to preserve food through the harshest months. Even the children though young, learned the importance of resourcefulness. They understood the need to save every scrap of food, to keep the fire burning to help gather whatever could be used. There were no luxuries here, no space for frivolity. Even the smallest piece of wood, the last morsel of bread, had value. The children learned to scrape together what was left to scavenge from the land to help in any way they could. In the end, it wasn't just the adults who had to be resourceful. It was the entire community. In the collective strength, the collective resourcefulness was what kept you all going, even when it seemed like the world was against you. You came to realize that resourcefulness wasn't just about survival. It was a mindset, a way of life. It was about seeing potential in what others discarded, about finding solutions when everything seemed impossible. And while the land may have been harsh and the cold relentless, you knew that as long as you could adapt, as long as you could find a way to make do, there was hope. Every day was a new challenge, a new chance to prove that you had the strength to face whatever the wilderness threw at you. And even though the conditions seemed insurmountable, you also knew that the very act of survival, the sheer determination to keep going, was what defined you. And it was the only way you could carve out a life in this unforgiving world. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, and already you could feel the weight of the day pressing down on you. The cold, damp air made it hard to breathe, but there was no time to dwell on it. The cabin was cold, and the fire had gone out in the night. The work was waiting, and it was going to be another long, exhausting day. The reality of survival was constantly before you, the land unforgiving offering no reprieve, and the tools insufficient, often crude, making each task feel harder than the last. There were no modern conveniences here, no easy shortcuts to ease the strain of daily life. Every task, from chopping firewood to planting crops, demanded more than just physical effort. It demanded creativity, patience, and an unyielding perseverance that at times seemed to drain your spirit as much as it drained your body. The tools you had were rudimentary at best. The axe was dull, its handle splintered from use and the long months of hard labor. The saw, which you had hoped would be your most valuable tool, was barely able to cut through the thick timber that surrounded your cabin. The blade was bent, the teeth worn down, and each stroke through the wood required a struggle. You would push with all your might, feeling the sweat bead on your forehead, but the wood never seemed to give easily. It was a constant fight against nature, with nothing but your own strength and limited tools to help you. Every cut was a laborious process, and the frustration grew with each swing. What should have been a simple task, cutting down a tree, gathering firewood, or building a fence, became a monumental challenge, stretching out the hours and making you wonder if the work would ever end. You quickly learned to improvise, to make do with what you had. The axe, though blunt, could still be used for chopping smaller branches, but it took longer and required more effort. You fashioned a new handle for the tool out of the trees nearby, using only the most basic of methods. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't the smooth, efficient instrument you had hoped for, but it worked. And that was enough. Every tool you used, from the spade to the hoe, was a compromise. The soil that you had hoped would be easy to till turned out to be rocky and stubborn, and with your inadequate tools, you struggled just to break the surface. You had to be resourceful, making use of every scrap of metal, every piece of wood, to keep your tools in working order. It wasn't about getting things done quickly. It was about surviving long enough to get things done at all. But it wasn't just the tools that caused frustration. It was the technology, or rather the lack of it. The settlers had brought with them their most trusted implements, the best they could find in their old world. But those tools, those methods, were designed for a different time, a different place. They were ill-suited to the unforgiving landscape of the New World, where everything was harder, where the trees were taller, the soil more difficult, and the cold more biting. The plows, though sturdy, could barely break through the ground, the metal blades dulling quickly against the stubborn earth. There was no machinery to speed up the work, no tractors to pull the plows, no modern equipment to make the task easier. What you had were your hands, your back, and the most basic of tools, and that had to be enough. But even the simplest tasks, like gathering firewood or setting traps, became exhausting and time-consuming. You recall the first winter when you and your fellow settlers struggled just to keep the fires burning. The winter had come early, catching everyone off guard. The cold was more intense than any of you had expected, and the firewood that had seemed like an abundant resource was running low. You had to chop the wood by hand, one piece at a time, and the axe you had was ill-equipped to handle the thick, wet logs that you needed to cut. Every swing felt like a punishment. Every piece of wood seemed to fight back, and the exhaustion of it all weighed heavily on you. There was no way to speed up the process. You had to keep going, each strike on the wood a reminder of how much work was left to do. The lack of modern tools also made every task more dangerous. You had no proper equipment to hunt, no traps to catch small game, and no reliable way to protect yourself from the predators that roamed the land. The animals, once a source of food, now seemed like an ever-present threat. You had to use whatever you could, simple snares, makeshift bows and arrows, and traps that often didn't work as they should. The constant failure of these crude tools made it even harder to stay hopeful. You would check your traps each morning, only to find them empty, and the hunger would grow in your stomach, gnawing at you, reminding you of just how little you had. The risk of injury was ever present. With tools that were ill-suited for the tasks they were meant to perform, accidents were inevitable. The axe, dull and difficult to control, would slip from your hands, causing blisters and bruises. The saw with its bent teeth would catch on the wood, making your hands ache and your wrists stiff. You had no medical supplies, no proper bandages, and the few herbs and remedies you had brought with you were barely enough to treat a simple cut, let alone a serious injury. You learned quickly to avoid the tools when possible, to use them only when necessary, and to work slowly and carefully. But accidents still happened. The lack of proper equipment made every task feel risky, every movement a potential injury waiting to happen. But the real cost of inadequate tools wasn't just the physical toll it took, it was the mental toll. Each day, you struggled to keep the cabin warm, to gather enough firewood, to farm the land, and to keep your family fed. The lack of proper tools and technology turned every simple task into a monumental effort, and the exhaustion of it all began to wear you down. You would wake up already tired from the day before and go out into the cold to work, only to find that the tools you had were still inadequate. There was no sense of progress, no sense that things were getting easier. Every day felt like a repeat of the one before, and you began to wonder if you would ever get ahead, if you would ever make it through the winter, if you would ever see the land that was promised to you begin to yield any of its bounty. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that got to you. It was the emotional strain. There was no room for error. If you made a mistake, if you failed to fix the tools, if you didn't gather enough wood or food, there was no one to help you. The settlement was isolated, and while there was a sense of community, the reality was that everyone was just as burdened as you were. You had to rely on your own strength, your own resourcefulness, and your ability to make the best of what you had. It felt like the world was conspiring against you, that every day was just another challenge to test your resolve. But despite the frustration, despite the pain, you learned to keep going. You learned to use your hands in ways you never had before, to adapt to the tools you had to make do with what was available. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to survive. As the seasons passed, you became more adept at working with what you had. You learned to repair the broken tools, to sharpen the dull blades, to create new tools from the materials at hand. What had once been a source of frustration became a way of life. You could see the other settlers around you too adapting. Some had learned how to make traps that worked, and others had become skilled at hunting with the simplest of bows. You were all in the same boat, and the struggle to survive had united you. There was a sense of pride in the work, a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing you had made do, that you had turned something crude and inadequate into something that worked. In the end, it wasn't just the lack of tools or technology that determined your fate. It was your ability to adapt, to improvise, and to persevere. The world around you was harsh, unforgiving, but it was also full of possibilities if you were willing to work hard and think creatively. The tools you had might not have been perfect, but with your resourcefulness, they became enough. And as you stood in front of your cabin, watching the snow fall once again, you realized that it wasn't just the land that you had conquered. It was the challenge of survival itself. And it was that challenge that had shaped you into someone capable of facing whatever came next. The winter had been harsher than anyone had expected. The days were shorter, the nights colder, and the isolation had begun to feel suffocating. The snow piled up, drifting against the cabins, sealing you and your neighbors into your little world. The wind howled outside, pushing against every wall, every crack trying to find its way in. Inside, it was no better. The cabin was cold, the fire barely enough to keep the chill at bay, and the days stretched on endlessly. It was a life you had never imagined when you first set out to settle in this new world. But in the midst of the cold, the hunger, and the hardship, there was one thing that stood out as a constant source of strength: community. It had taken some time to come to terms with it, but you realized that survival here was never meant to be a solitary endeavor. No one could survive alone, not in the harsh wilderness, not in the long, brutal winters. And as the days wore on, it became more and more clear that without the help of your neighbors, without the support of the small community that had formed around you, you would not have made it through. There was a bond, an unspoken agreement that no one would be left behind, that everyone would share what little they had, no matter how meager the resources were. You learned quickly that the survival of the individual was inseparable from the survival of the community. You remember the first time you truly understood what it meant to rely on others. It had been a particularly harsh night, the kind where the wind howled through the trees like a wild animal, and the cold seeped into every corner of your cabin. The firewood, which had once seemed abundant, was now nearly gone. The little stash of food you had managed to save was growing smaller by the day. You had no choice but to venture out, hoping to find enough firewood to last the night. The snow was deep, and the cold was unbearable, but you knew that without fire, you and your family would be in serious trouble. As you stepped outside, the sight of your neighbor's cabin caught your eye. Smoke rose from the chimney more than yours, stronger, warmer. They had something you didn't. You knocked the cold biting at your face, but the warmth that greeted you inside was like stepping into another world. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. And there, sitting at the table, were your neighbors, sharing their meal, their laughter, and their warmth. Without hesitation, they welcomed you in, offering not just their food, but their firewood. It wasn't a handout. It was a mutual offering, a shared understanding that in this place, survival was about looking out for one another. They had what you needed, and you, when the time came, would offer them the same. This was not a world where people hoarded what they had. It couldn't be. The land itself made it clear there was no abundance here, no wealth to protect. What little you had was always on the brink of running out. It was a harsh, hard life, and each day was a struggle. But in that struggle, you began to see something beautiful, the way neighbors helped one another without question. If someone had extra firewood, it was shared. If there was a meal to be made, it was made for everyone. If someone fell ill, the others would care for them, offering what little medicine, comfort, and food they had. The idea of community had a deeper meaning here than anywhere else. It wasn't just about living near each other. It was about depending on each other. You had to. No one could make it alone. In the evenings, as the cold pressed in and the wind howled through the trees, you and your neighbors would gather together. The little cabin was crowded, filled with warmth, conversation, and laughter. The simple act of sharing a meal, of sitting together around a fire, became something to look forward to. You were all in this together, struggling, surviving, but never alone. These small moments of connection became your lifeline, the thing that kept you going when everything else seemed so bleak. The cold outside didn't matter as much when you were inside, surrounded by the people who cared, who understood what it took to survive this harsh world. And then there were the times when the community went above and beyond. When your own firewood ran out, when the last of your food had been eaten, it wasn't just your immediate neighbors who came to your aid. Others from across the settlement would come bringing firewood, food, whatever they had. No one kept track of who had given what or who owed whom. There was no barter here, no exchange of goods. It was simply a matter of life and death. People gave what they could because they knew that in a place like this, tomorrow might bring hardship for anyone. And when it did, they would need others to help them, just as you had helped them. The importance of community became more apparent as the days wore on. The mental and physical toll of surviving the winters, the constant exhaustion from lack of food, the stress of having to fight every day for warmth, for shelter, for safety. It was almost too much to bear. But when you looked around, when you saw the strength of your fellow settlers, you realized that the load was lighter when it was shared. You couldn't afford to isolate yourself. You had to stay connected to stay involved. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving together, about finding moments of peace in the midst of chaos, about creating a support system where everyone contributed and no one was left behind. There were times when it seemed like the land was fighting against you, when the weather was so harsh and the resources so scarce that you wondered how much longer you could endure. But then a neighbor would come by with an extra sack of flour, or you'd hear a knock on your door and find a bundle of firewood waiting for you. These small acts of kindness, of mutual aid, were what kept the community alive. You realized that no one could survive here alone. The land with its challenges was unforgiving, but the people who had come here together were strong because of their unity, their willingness to share, to help, to give. Over time, the hardships began to feel a little less heavy. The land had not become easier. In fact, it was still as brutal as ever. But there was a strength in numbers, a strength in knowing that there were others who had your back. The mental toll of isolation, the fear of never having enough, the anxiety of what tomorrow might bring. These were softened by the presence of the community. Every day, you faced the same struggles, the same fears. But every day, you also found new ways to connect with the people around you, to share in the hardship, to make life just a little easier. You learned that community wasn't just a group of people living in the same place. It was a bond that transcended the physical. It was about trust, about shared effort, about mutual reliance. In a world that demanded everything from you, the one thing you could rely on was the people around you. The shared labor, the shared struggles, the shared victories, these were what held the settlement together. Every time you passed a neighbor's cabin, every time you exchanged a wave or a smile, you were reminded of the unspoken pact that had been made. No one was in this alone. And then, as the days grew longer and the first signs of spring began to show themselves, you realized something important. It wasn't just about surviving the winter or the hardships that came with it. It was about the strength of the people around you, the resilience of the community that had been forged in the fires of struggle. Without them, you would not have made it through. And with them, you knew that no matter what the land threw at you next, you would find a way to survive together. As the winter began to ease its grip, and the first hints of spring crept across the land, you stood at the edge of the settlement, looking out over the vast, snow-covered expanse. The harshness of the season had worn deep into the very fabric of your existence. The struggle for survival had been a relentless, all-consuming battle, one that tested not just your physical endurance, but the strength of your spirit, your very will to live. Hunger had gnawed at you day after day. Illness had claimed the lives of those you knew and loved, and the isolation had pressed down on your mind like a heavy weight. Yet here you were, standing in the aftermath of it all. You had made it. You had survived. But survival wasn't just a matter of one person's strength. It was the culmination of countless acts of kindness, countless moments of solidarity, and the collective will of a community that refused to let the land defeat them. The settlers had come to this land with little more than hope and determination, and through sheer grit, they had carved out a life in the face of unimaginable odds. The relentless cold, the lack of food, the endless days of isolation, they had all become a part of the struggle, but they did not define the settlers. What defined them was their ability to endure, to adapt, and most importantly, to support one another. The sense of community had proven to be the cornerstone of survival. It wasn't just about the practicalities of sharing food or firewood, though those things were vital. It was about the emotional support, the sense of belonging, the feeling that you weren't alone in your fight. Each person, no matter how small their contribution, played a role in the survival of the settlement. A neighbor would share a loaf of bread when the last crumbs of your own had been eaten. Another would offer a helping hand to repair a cabin even when their own needed repair. The settlers had learned quickly that their fates were intertwined, that they were stronger together than apart. And it was in this spirit of cooperation, of mutual aid, that they had endured. Adaptability was another key to their survival. The land had been harsh and unpredictable, but the settlers had learned to bend without breaking. They had found new ways to hunt together to preserve food. They had learned to make do with what they had, to repurpose old tools to repair what was broken. They didn't have the conveniences of the old world, no stores to buy from, no factories to supply them with goods. But they had something far more valuable: resourcefulness. They adapted to the land, not by changing it, but by learning how to live in harmony with it, how to make the most of what it offered. In doing so, they became more than just survivors. They became stewards of the land, understanding its rhythms, its dangers, and its rewards. But perhaps the greatest testament to their endurance was the human spirit. The settlers faced challenges that would have broken many, but they pushed on. The cold could freeze their bones, the hunger could gnaw at their insides, and the isolation could rob them of their will to continue, but they persevered. It was in the darkest hours of the night, when the wind howled outside and the cold pressed in around them, that their true strength was revealed. They didn't give up. They didn't let the land defeat them, and they didn't let the hardships of one season, however long it seemed, define their lives. Instead, they fought for each day, each breath, each chance at survival, knowing that each moment was a victory. And as you reflect on their struggle, you realize that the legacy of these early settlers still echoes today. The generations that followed the children, born of this hard-earned survival, the communities that grew from these first few who braved the land, carry with them the resilience and fortitude of their ancestors. Their determination, their adaptability, and their sense of community continue to shape the spirit of the nation that would rise from the ashes of those early hardships. The settlers who endured these trials laid the groundwork for a future that would be built on the very values that allowed them to survive: perseverance, collaboration, and an unbreakable will to endure no matter the odds. In the end, the story of the settlers is not just a tale of hardship and survival. It is a story of triumph, of what can be achieved when people come together, when they refuse to let fear or hardship define their lives. The legacy of their strength, their unity, and their unyielding spirit is not just a part of history. It is woven into the fabric of every generation that has followed, a reminder that no matter how great the struggle, the human spirit will always find a way to endure.